She had been turned away from 6 towns in 2 years, not because she couldn't do the work, but because nobody wanted to look at her long enough to find out. The morning she rode into Caldwell Crossing, she had $11, a canvas bag with a broken strap, and a horse that wasn't hers. By sundown, she'd either have a reason to stay or she'd be gone like smoke. What happened in between would change everything. For her, for a man who'd stopped believing in much of anything, and for a town that was about to learn the cost of being wrong about a person. Stay with us until the very end, because this is the kind of story that reminds you what people are actually made of. If this is your kind of story, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The town of Caldwell Crossing sat low in a valley between 2 ridgelines that caught the wind wrong, so that in winter the cold came in sideways, and in summer the heat pressed down from every direction at once. It wasn't a welcoming place by design or by accident. It was simply a place that had decided, sometime in its rough early years, that survival mattered more than comfort, and it had never found a reason to revise that position. Sarah Whitmore rode in on a borrowed mare named Clover, a red roan with a white blaze and the temperament of a schoolteacher who'd been underpaid for too long. The horse wasn't hers. She'd traded a silver button off her mother's coat for the use of her for a week, the button pressed into the palm of a Mennonite farmer outside of Harlan who hadn't asked many questions. Sarah had appreciated that more than she could say. She was 28 years old, which wasn't old, but which felt old out here, where women her age were either married with children clinging to their skirts or had left the frontier entirely for somewhere with proper sidewalks and Sunday socials. Sarah was neither. She was just a woman on a horse with a bag across her lap, and the particular expression of someone who has been disappointed enough times that they've stopped letting it show on their face while it's happening. The main street of Caldwell Crossing was unpaved and rutted from the last rain, which had come 3 weeks ago and left the mud in that in-between state, no longer soft enough to sink in, but uneven enough to turn an ankle if you weren't watching. 2 saloons faced each other across the street like they were in an argument they'd been having for years. There was a feed store, a general goods shop, a post office operating out of what had clearly been someone's house, and a building with a hand-painted sign that said Land Office over a door that didn't quite fit its frame. Sarah tied Clover to the post outside the feed store and stood for a moment with her hand on the horse's neck, not because she needed steadying, but because she had learned it was useful to stop before walking into a new place, to look at it, to read what it was telling you before it started telling you other things it didn't mean. What Caldwell Crossing was telling her was, "We've seen your kind before, and we are not particularly moved." She went in anyway. The feed store smelled like grain dust and the particular sweetness of hay that's been kept dry, and behind the counter a man with a red beard and ink-stained fingers was writing something in a ledger with the focus of a man who had learned that if he looked up, someone would want something from him. "Looking for work," Sarah said. He looked up, took her in. The bag, the road dust on her coat, the way her boots were worn at the heel but cleaned, the hands that were calloused in the specific way that came from actual work rather than occasional chores. "Not hiring," he said. "Do you know who is?" He considered this. Not the question. The question was easy. But whether he wanted to spend the time answering it. "Pierce, maybe. He runs cattle out past the South Creek. Might need someone come fall." "It's spring." "That's right." She nodded and picked up her bag. "Thank you." She went to 3 more places that morning, and the answers were variations on the same theme. The livery stable needed no one. The general store had just taken on a boy from a family that had come through from Nebraska. The woman who ran the boarding house, a Mrs. Elspeth Crane, 60-ish, with the bearing of someone who had once had better furniture, looked Sarah up and down and said, very kindly in the way that kind words sometimes made things worse, "I think you might find things easier further west, dear. Caldwell Crossing is a particular sort of town." Sarah stood outside on the board sidewalk and let the morning sun hit her face for a moment. She was not going to cry. She had decided sometime around the 3rd town that crying was a luxury she couldn't afford in public, and she had kept to that with the consistency she applied to most things she decided. What she was going to do was eat something, because she hadn't since yesterday evening, and then she was going to think about what came next. further west. She'd been hearing that her whole life, further west, further along, somewhere down the road. And she was starting to wonder if there was a version of it that ended somewhere, or if it just kept going until the land ran out and you fell into the Pacific Ocean. She was eating a piece of bread she'd bought from the baker, a silent transaction, which she appreciated, when she heard it. It was a horse sound, not the ordinary kind, not the shift and stamp of a horse tied to a post. This was something different, lower and more sustained, the kind of sound that came from pain that had been going on long enough that the animal had stopped being frightened of it and had just settled into it like bad weather. She looked up. Across the street, outside the land office, 3 horses were tied to a long iron rail. 2 of them were ordinary, a gray and a pinto, but the third was a bay gelding, tall and well-built, the kind of horse that cost real money, and he was standing wrong. His weight was shifted forward off his left rear leg, and he was holding the hoof just clear of the ground, not in the dramatic way that meant an acute injury, but in the careful, deliberate way that meant he'd been doing it for a while and had developed a system. Sarah crossed the street. She came up on the bay's left side, slow and without making any particular effort to announce herself, because horses didn't need announcement so much as they needed not to be startled. She put her hand on his flank first, let him feel her, and he turned his head and looked at her with one large brown eye, and the expression common to horses who are in discomfort, and have been for long enough that they've given up expecting help from people. "I see you," she said quietly. She crouched down and ran her hand down the leg. The leg itself was clean, no obvious swelling, no heat in the cannon bone. She moved her hand to the hoof and lifted it carefully, and the horse shifted his weight cooperatively, which told her something. A horse that won't let you handle the bad leg usually has a worse injury than one that does. He was hurting, but he wasn't broken. She found it in the hoof. A stone, wedged up into the cleft of the frog at an angle that would have been invisible from above, small enough that whoever had tended to him last had missed it or hadn't looked. It had been there long enough to cause bruising. She could feel the heat. She reached into the side pocket of her bag, the front one with the broken buckle that she kept closed with a piece of wire, and found the hoof pick she carried out of habit more than planning. She worked the stone free with 3 careful movements, and the bay exhaled, a long, slow breath, and shifted his weight back onto the leg in the tentative way of someone testing whether it still hurt. It would still hurt for a while. The bruising wouldn't be gone by morning, but it wasn't going to get worse. "That's better," she said. "You'll need to rest it." "You want to explain what you're doing to my horse?" The voice came from the doorway of the land office. The man standing there was tall, not unusually so, but tall enough that he'd had to turn his shoulders slightly to come through the door, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that had been weathered past the point of being called handsome into something that was just honest. He was wearing work clothes rather than town clothes, which meant he'd come in for business and wasn't happy about having to. He had a particular look in his eyes that Sarah had seen before on men who were managing a situation they hadn't signed up for and didn't have the patience to handle graciously. "Removing a stone," she said. She stood up and held it out to him on her palm, a wedge of shale, dark gray, about the size of a thumbnail. It was wedged up into the frog on a bad angle. He's been favoring that leg for a while. A week, maybe more. The man came down the 2 steps from the office and looked at the stone in her hand and then at the horse, who was now standing with his weight more evenly distributed and looking considerably less miserable. Something shifted in the man's expression. Not gratitude exactly. It was something that came before gratitude. The moment when you realize something has happened that you didn't expect. "Nobody told me he was favoring," he said. It wasn't directed at her particularly. It was the kind of thing people said when they were recalibrating. "You might not have noticed from the front," Sarah said. He'd learned to compensate. "You'd have to be watching the rear." He looked at her then. A real look. Not the dismissive glance she'd gotten at the feed store. He took in the same things, the bag, the boots, the hands, but he was reading them differently, as information rather than as a category. "You work with horses," he said, "and cattle, and most things that need doing on a working ranch." She picked up her bag from where she'd set it down. I was going to ask at the land office if you'd heard of anyone hiring, but I expect you're busy. I'm not hiring, the man said. She nodded. There it was again, the same two words, the same door closing. She had gotten very efficient at recognizing the sound of it. She turned to go. I'm Jack Callaway, he said. She stopped. Callaway Ranch, south of town, 700 acres. I've got 40 head of cattle that are down to 36 because I lost 4 to a fence failure last month, and I don't have enough hands who know what they're doing to tell me why the fences keep failing. I've got a grandmother who is sick and won't admit it. I've got a banknote that comes due in 2 months and a hay yield that won't cover it. Sarah turned back around slowly. I'm not hiring, he said again. I said that. What I'm saying is something different. He paused, and she could see him deciding something, could see the exact moment he decided it. I'm asking, whatever that's worth to you. She looked at him for a long moment. He wasn't a man who was used to asking. That much was clear. There was something almost painful about the way he'd said it, like a tooth he'd been avoiding and had finally pulled. Sarah Whitmore, she said, what do you want for pay? A fair wage and a clear accounting of what I'm expected to do and what I'm not. And if the arrangement doesn't work for either of us, we say so and part ways without making it ugly. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. It wasn't quite respect, wasn't quite surprise, was something in between. That's reasonable. I know, she said. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that happens when two practical people are both doing arithmetic. My horse, Jack said, looking at the bay. Will he be all right to ride home? Slow ride, don't push him. She hesitated, then added, You should have someone look at the frog in a few days. Make sure there's no abscess forming. He nodded. He untied the bay from the rail, and the horse moved with him without the hitch in his gait, slowly, tentatively, but without the careful avoidance of before. Jack ran a hand down the animal's neck and looked at him for a moment the way people look at things they care about more than they readily admit. Then he looked back at Sarah. There's a wagon coming into town this afternoon. Porter, the feedman. He owes me a favor. He'll take you and your things out to the ranch. I've got one more thing to sign in there, and then I'll ride ahead. He paused. Unless you've changed your mind. I haven't changed my mind, Sarah said. She didn't tell him that she'd been ready to leave Caldwell Crossing for good when she heard that horse. That she'd been standing on the sidewalk eating bread and calculating how far $11 would take her if she was careful about it. She didn't tell him any of that because it wasn't useful information, and because she had learned that the less you told people about your desperation, the less hold they had over you. What she did was nod and pick up her bag and sit down on the bench outside the land office to wait. Porter was a short man with a mustache that took up most of his face and a complete unwillingness to fill silence with conversation, which Sarah considered an excellent quality in a man you'd be sharing a wagon bench with for an hour. He said, Callaway place? When she climbed up and she said yes, and that was essentially the entirety of their interaction for the first 40 minutes. The road south out of Caldwell Crossing was better maintained than the main street, which suggested that whoever maintained roads in this county had their priorities reasonably sorted. It crossed the creek on a solid timber bridge, newer than everything else around it, the boards still pale, and then climbed a low rise before dropping into the valley where the Callaway land opened up. Sarah had seen a lot of land. She'd worked on ranches from eastern Kansas to the Colorado foothills, had seen places that announced themselves grandly and places that hid what they were until you'd been there long enough to understand them. The Callaway Ranch was the second kind. At first glance, it looked like struggle. A fence line that sagged in places, a barn that needed paint on its south wall. Cattle spread thin across pasture that was green now, but showed the dry soil patterns that meant summer would be a challenge. The house was bigger than she'd expected, but plainer. A 2-story frame structure with a porch that ran the full front and 2 windows upstairs that caught the late afternoon light and threw it back copper-colored. But there was something else. The way the land itself was shaped, the way the water moved through it, the location of the buildings relative to the wind and the sun and the slope of the ground. Someone had thought carefully about this place a long time ago. Someone had known what they were doing when they chose it. Here, Porter said, and pulled the horses up. He helped her down without being asked, which she appreciated, and drove off without ceremony, which she appreciated even more. She stood in the yard with her bag and looked at the house and the barn and the three men who had stopped what they were doing to look at her. Two of them were ranch hands. She could tell by the way they stood the particular weight-forward posture of men who spent most of their hours moving rather than sitting. The third was younger, maybe 19, with a sunburned nose and an expression of open curiosity that he hadn't yet learned to close down. Jack came out of the barn. He'd taken off his jacket and rolled his sleeves, which meant he'd gone straight to work when he got back, which told her something about him. "You made it," he said. "I said I would." He introduced the two older hands as Deacon and Rafe. Both nodded without warmth but also without hostility, which was about what she expected. The younger one was Tommy, and he stuck his hand out immediately and said, "Tommy Briggs, pleased to meet you," with the sincerity of someone who hadn't yet learned to moderate it, which made her like him immediately. "You'll bunk in the house," Jack said. "Back room on the ground floor. Used to be a pantry, so it's small, but it has a window and a door that closes." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you described a practical arrangement, with none of the awkwardness some men brought to the subject of an unmarried woman sleeping under the same roof. She appreciated that too. "Fine," she said. "I'll show you where things are." The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was a working kitchen. Not decorative, not organized around any principle except getting food from one state to another. There were copper pots hung on a rack above the stove, and a long wooden table that had been scrubbed so many times it had gone pale in the middle. A door off the kitchen led to what had been the pantry, a narrow room with a cot against one wall, a wooden shelf above it, and a window that looked east. The window was clean. Someone had cleaned it recently. "My grandmother's room is at the top of the stairs," Jack said. "You'll meet her at supper. I'll warn you. She'll have opinions." "About me?" "About everything, but yes." He paused at the kitchen doorway. "She's not easy." "I'm not looking for easy," Sarah said. He looked at her with that same expression, not quite reading her, not quite sure what to make of her. And then he left her to unpack, which amounted to taking her spare shirt and pants out of the bag, hanging them on the wooden pegs behind the door, and setting her hoof pick and the small roll of bandage material she carried on the shelf above the cot. She sat on the cot for a moment in the quiet. The mattress was thin, but it was real, which was better than she could say for 2 of the 6 places she'd worked in the past 2 years. The room smelled like cedar and dried herbs, and underneath that the specific neutral smell of a space that had been empty for a while. She was not going to let herself feel relieved. Relief led to comfort, and comfort led to the assumption that you could stay, and she had learned not to assume that anywhere. But she let herself sit for a moment, just a moment, and she looked at the window and the pale evening light coming through it, and let herself think, one night. One night, and then you see what the morning is. Supper that first evening was a revelation in the way that difficult things sometimes are. Sarah had set the table. She'd found where everything was kept by looking methodically through the kitchen rather than asking, because she preferred to learn a place rather than be taught it. And she'd put water on to boil and found the beans that had been soaking since morning and started them heating. She wasn't cooking the meal. She didn't presume that. But she wasn't going to stand in the kitchen and do nothing while someone else did it, so she did the parts that were obvious and left the rest. The someone else turned out to be Deacon, who could cook and knew it and didn't want help from anyone, thank you. He accepted her contribution of setting the table and starting the beans with the look of a man who has decided to tolerate something rather than welcome it. Hattie Callaway came down the stairs at 6:10. She was 72 years old, or close to it, and she moved like someone who was in the ongoing process of negotiating with her own body about how much cooperation it was going to offer. She used a cane, a good one, carved dark wood, but not in the way of someone who needed it desperately. In the way of someone who had accepted it and made it part of how she carried herself. She was small, which surprised Sarah. The presence of her had preceded her down the stairs somehow, the sound of the careful footsteps and the tap of the cane, and Sarah had expected a larger woman. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Sarah with dark eyes that were quick and assessing in the way of someone who had looked at a great many things over a long life and had developed opinions about all of them. "You're the woman Jack picked up in town," she said. Not a question. "Sarah Whitmore," Sarah said. He didn't ask me. No, ma'am. He should have. Yes, ma'am. Hattie Callaway looked at her for a long moment, and Sarah stood in it without shifting or filling it with words. She had learned that some silences were tests. Hattie said, and came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread that Deacon made in the cast-iron skillet with evident pride. And it was good. Genuinely good, the cornbread especially, with a crust that had caught just right and an interior that was still moist. Tommy ate with the focused energy of a young man who'd been working since before light. Rafe and Deacon ate in the particular silence of men who had been eating together long enough that they didn't need to talk. Jack ate the way he did other things, Sarah noticed, without waste, without hurry, paying attention. Hattie watched Sarah the entire meal, not rudely, not with hostility exactly, but with the steady, evaluating attention of someone who had not decided anything yet and was in no rush to. "Where are you from?" Hattie asked when the meal was mostly done. "Montana originally," Sarah said. "Worked ranches in Kansas and Colorado after that." "You have family?" "Not anymore." Hattie nodded, very slightly, the way people nod at information they already suspected. "And you think you can help this ranch?" It wasn't quite a question. Sarah took a breath and decided on honesty, which she generally preferred even when it was inconvenient. "I don't know yet. I think I can help with livestock and fence management, and I can do the work of 2 average hands. Whether that's what this ranch needs, I won't know until I've seen it properly." Hattie looked at Jack. "She talks like somebody who's made promises before and had them break on her." "Yes," Sarah said before Jack could answer. "That's accurate." Something shifted in Hattie's face then. A small thing, barely visible. Not softening, exactly. Something more like recognition. She didn't say anything else about it. She finished her supper and excused herself and went back upstairs, and the table let out a collective breath that no one acknowledged. Tommy looked at Sarah. "She's not usually that not mean," he said, and then seemed to think about how that sounded. "I mean, I know what you mean," Sarah said. Stunned. The first week was a matter of learning. She woke before the others. She always had. It was simply how she was built. And walked the fence lines in the early morning while the light was still gray and the dew was still on everything. This was when you saw a ranch, honestly, before the day's work covered over its problems with noise and motion. She walked and looked and made notes in the small book she carried, not many words, just enough to track what she'd seen and where. The fence failures Jack had mentioned were not random. That was the first thing she noticed. They occurred in a pattern. The southeast corner of the south pasture, where the ground was softer after rain, where the posts had been set too shallow in soil that expanded and contracted with the moisture and dried out in summer and pushed the posts out of true. It wasn't a maintenance failure so much as a design problem, one that had probably been there from the beginning and had only gotten worse as the posts aged. She told Jack this on the third morning, standing in the south pasture with her notes open, and he listened in the way she was coming to recognize as his listening, not still exactly, but contained, all his attention gathered into a point. "How do you fix it?" he asked. "Steel posts at the corners, sunk deeper and set in concrete if you can get it. Wooden posts in between are fine, but the corners need to hold more than they're currently being asked to hold." "That's not cheap." "No," she agreed, "but it's cheaper than losing cattle. The fence fails and they scatter, and you lose time finding them, and you risk losing them entirely. And a cow in the wrong place at the wrong time." She stopped. "You know that part." He did. She could see it in his face. "I'll get the materials," he said. "Next week, if the bank conversation goes how I need it to go." She nodded and closed her notes. He was already starting to walk back toward the barn when he stopped and turned. "Where did you learn to read fences like that?" "A man named Wallace Pruitt in Colorado. He'd been ranching for 40 years, and he could tell you everything that was going to go wrong on a spread just by walking it." She paused. "He was not a particularly pleasant man, but he was an excellent teacher." Jack almost smiled. It was brief, the smile of a man out of practice, but it was real. "I've known a few of those," he said. Hattie came down later in the mornings than anyone else. This was not, Sarah came to understand, laziness or infirmity. It was the particular economics of pain, the way that morning stiffness had to be managed before it could be overcome, and that the overcoming took longer than it used to. She never complained. She simply arrived in the kitchen at whatever hour the negotiations had concluded for that day. On the fourth morning, Sarah left tea on the stove for her. Not placed prominently, not with any note, just the pot, kept warm, at the right height for someone who didn't want to bend more than necessary. She said nothing about it. Hattie didn't mention it either. But when Sarah came in from the barn at midday, there was a piece of cornbread on a plate on the table. Hattie's cornbread, which Sarah had learned to identify by a particular something in the crumb, and it was covered with a cloth to keep it from drying out. Neither of them mentioned this either. It was the beginning of something, though Sarah wasn't sure yet what to call it. Communication, maybe, of the kind that didn't require the risk of words. Quote, the livestock problems were less straightforward than the fences. 3 of the remaining cattle showed signs of a respiratory issue. Nothing catastrophic, but left alone it would spread. Sarah caught it on the 5th day, during what she had made her daily habit of moving through the herd slowly, looking and listening, the kind of attention that wasn't taught so much as developed over years of paying it. She brought it to Jack the same evening. I've seen this before, she said. It responds to separation and some basic treatment. If we move these 3 to the small pen and watch them, we can probably keep it from getting into the rest of the herd. He looked tired. She had noticed over the past week that Jack Callaway carried his tiredness in a particular way. It didn't show in his body so much as in moments of stillness, brief pauses between actions where his face went somewhere else for a second before coming back. How long have you been watching the herd like that? He asked. Since I got here. Every day? Every day. He looked at her, and the tiredness in his face shifted into something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. The look of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has suddenly realized someone is standing nearby. All right, he said. Show me which 3. They went out in the last light of the evening, and Sarah moved through the herd and pointed. And Jack watched her and watched the cattle and asked 3 or 4 questions that were good questions, the kind that showed he was actually thinking about what she was saying rather than waiting to speak. Later, walking back to the barn, Tommy fell into step beside her. Mr. Callaway hasn't looked at this herd like that in a while, Tommy said. He said it quietly, not looking at her, in the cautious way of someone sharing something they weren't sure they should. What do you mean? After his wife died, that was 2 years ago before I came on, Deacon says he sort of went inside himself, still running everything, still keeping it together, but not, Tommy searched for the word, not seeing it, like he was managing it instead of living in it. Sarah walked for a moment in silence. That's not an unusual thing, she said finally. Grief does that. I know, Tommy said. I just mean the way he was asking you questions out there. He was seeing it again. She didn't answer because there wasn't a clean answer to give. She walked back to the house and went to her room and sat on the narrow cot and looked out the east window where the moon was coming up over the ridge. She thought about what Tommy had said. She thought about Jack in the pasture, asking good questions in the failing light. She thought about $11 and a horse that wasn't hers and a town that had told her to go further west. She was not going to build anything on this. She was not going to let herself decide that this place was permanent, or that the careful thing that seemed to be growing here, between her and the land, between her and this fractured, holding itself together household, was anything other than what it was right now. A week old, fragile, entirely unproven. But it was something. She lay down on the cot and pulled the thin blanket up and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into its night. The horses shifting in the barn, something moving in the grass outside, the low voice of the wind through the eaves. And she thought, one more morning, see what one more morning is. She was still thinking it when she fell asleep. The second week on the Callaway ranch started the same as the first had ended, with Sarah up before the light, walking the fence lines, writing in her small book, and arriving back at the barn with enough time to help Deacon with the morning feeding before anyone else had fully committed to being awake. The 3 sick cattle in the isolation pen were holding steady. Not better yet, but not worse, which was the right direction for this early. She'd been putting together a treatment from what she'd found in the barn stores, Not ideal, but workable. And checking on them twice a day, morning and evening, with the methodical patience that was either a virtue or a personality defect, depending on who was observing it. Tommy helped her one evening without being asked, just appeared at the pen gate with a bucket, and she'd put him to work without ceremony, explaining what she was doing and why. And he'd listened with the focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to learn rather than just wanted to seem helpful. That distinction mattered to her. "How do you know it won't spread to the rest?" he'd asked. "I don't know for certain," she said. "I know we gave it less opportunity to." He seemed to find this an acceptable answer, which told her he was smarter than his age sometimes suggested. Said, "The ditch happened on a Tuesday, in the hour after the midday meal when the light was flat, and the heat had crept up into the 80s and everyone was moving a degree slower than they should have been. Tommy had been moving the yearlings from the north pasture to the holding pen near the barn. A routine enough task, one he'd done before. But routine tasks had a way of going wrong in the specific moments when you stopped treating them as if they could. The yearlings had been cooperative right up until they weren't, which was how yearlings operated. And when the small red one broke to the left and found the old drainage ditch that ran along the fence line, it went in before Tommy could do anything to prevent it. The ditch was maybe 6 feet deep at that section and steep-sided, and the yearling, she was probably 400 pounds, not a small animal, hit the bottom at a bad angle and couldn't get her footing to come back up. She was frightened past the point of being useful, legs scrabbling at the clay walls, making everything worse with every attempt. Tommy was at the barn door shouting before the sound had fully registered. Deacon got there first, and Rafe a few seconds behind him, and then Sarah, and then Jack from the equipment shed where he'd been working on the mower. They stood at the edge of the ditch and looked down at the yearling, who had by now exhausted herself slightly and was standing at the bottom trembling, one leg folded under her at a wrong angle. "Pull her out," Deacon said. He said it with the authority of someone who had made a decision and considered the matter settled. "That leg," Sarah said. "It'll hold." "You don't know that." She was already crouching, looking at the angle of the ditch walls, looking at the yearling, looking at the ground. "If that leg is broken and you pull her out wrong, you'll injure her worse coming up. And then you've got a 400-pound animal in serious distress and no good way out of it." "I've pulled animals out of ditches before," Deacon said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who had decided he was done being contradicted. "I know you have. I'm not questioning your experience." She stood. "I'm looking at this specific animal in this specific situation." She moved along the edge of the ditch, looking at it from different angles. "She's not broken. Look at how she's holding the leg. It's not the joint. It's above the knee. Muscle, probably, or a deep bruise from hitting the wall. If we get her angle right before we pull, she can use that leg herself." Deacon looked at Jack. This was the moment. Sarah understood it clearly and didn't try to manage it or hurry it. The moment when Deacon looked at Jack to see who's read on the situation Jack was going to take. She wasn't going to beg for it. She'd said what she saw. Jack looked at the yearling. He looked at the ditch. He looked at Sarah. "What do you need?" he said. Deacon made a short, sharp sound that wasn't quite a word and walked 3 paces away and stood with his back to them, which was its own kind of statement, but not one that could be argued with. "Rope," Sarah said. "2 lengths, and I need someone who can be calm in a small space because one of us is going in with her." "I'll go," Tommy said immediately. "No," Sarah said. "I will. You'll be on the rope." Jack started to say something, and she looked at him, and whatever it was stayed where it was. She went down into the ditch the way you went into any tight space with a frightened animal, slowly, and with a quality of attention in her body that communicated something to the animal without being definable in human terms. The yearling shied and pressed against the far wall, one eye rolling white, nostrils working. Sarah crouched down and made herself small and waited. The bottom of the ditch was damp clay, and it smelled like old water and mineral earth, and the walls were close enough that she could touch both at once with her arms extended. The yearling was breathing in the fast, shallow rhythm of fear. "Hey," Sarah said quietly, not to communicate anything specific, just to put a human voice into the space. The yearling's ear flicked. "You're all right," Sarah said. "You went in wrong, and you hurt yourself, and that's not the end of anything. We're going to get you out of here." She knew the yearling couldn't understand the words. She wasn't speaking for the words. She was speaking to put something steady into the air between them, to give the animal something to orient toward other than her own panic. She worked her way closer, and the yearling let her, and she got her hands on the animal and felt along the injured leg carefully. The muscle above the knee was tight and hot, bruised and strained, not torn, and certainly not broken. She could feel the tension in it like a rope pulled too hard. It would hurt. It would hurt for days. But it was workable. "All right," she called up. "Send down the ropes." They worked it together. Sarah from below, guiding the animal's angle, Tommy on one rope and Rafe on the other, Jack directing from the edge. It took 20 minutes and 2 false starts and one moment when the yearling panicked and almost knocked Sarah into the wall, which left her with a bruised shoulder she wouldn't mention until later. But when the yearling came up over the edge, her weight forward, the bad leg coming up last and careful, she came up on her own power. All 4 feet hit the level ground, and she stood there shaking, and then she lowered her head and blew a long breath and looked around at the grass, as if she'd never expected to see it again. Tommy let out a sound that wasn't quite a word. Sarah came up out of the ditch after, using the rope Tommy threw back down, and she stood on the edge and looked at the yearling and felt the bruise in her shoulder starting to announce itself with more clarity. "Good girl," she said, and she meant it for the animal, though Tommy heard it and grinned. Jack was looking at her, not in any way that needed to be categorized, just looking, the way he sometimes did, as if he was adding information to something he was still building. "I'll look at that leg tonight," Sarah said, and walked back toward the barn. Deacon was already gone. Tut. He came to find her that evening. She was in the barn, working on the yearling's leg with the wrap she'd prepared. A cold compress first, then a proper support wrap. And she heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his boots on the barn floor that she'd learned to distinguish from the others without consciously trying to. He stood at the stall door and watched her work for a moment. "You went in without asking," he said. "Yes. I was going to tell you not to." "I know. So why didn't you wait for me to say it?" She finished the wrap and smoothed it flat and checked her tension before answering. "Because if I'd waited for the conversation, we'd have lost another 3 minutes, and in 3 minutes that animal could have hurt herself worse." She stood and looked at him across the stall door. "If you want to tell me I did it wrong, tell me, but I'd do it the same way again." Jack stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Outside, the evening was going down in strips of red and orange that came through the barn's open door and made everything look like it was on the edge of something. "Deacon has been with this ranch for 11 years, he said finally. "I know. He's not wrong about most things." "I know that too." She came out of the stall and latched it behind her. "He's right about 90% of what he does, and I'm not trying to replace that. I'm saying he was wrong about that specific thing this afternoon, and I happen to know why because I've been in 3 ditches with 3 different animals, and I know what that leg position means." She met his eyes. "If I thought he was right, I would have let him do it." Something in Jack's jaw worked. Not quite a word, not quite nothing. Then, "The bank is coming out Thursday." The subject change was abrupt enough that it felt deliberate, like a door being closed on one room so they could stand in another. "All right," she said. "They want to look at the operation. The note is, I've been carrying it on extensions for 18 months. They want to know the ranch is viable before they give me another." Sarah leaned against the stall door and looked at him. In the low barn light, his face was harder to read than usual. "Is it viable?" she asked. "If I can get the fence fixed and the herd stable and the hay yield up by August, it's viable." He paused. "Those are 3 significant ifs. The fence we can start this week if the materials come in. The herd," she thought of the 3 in isolation, who were already showing some improvement. "The herd is better than you think. You've been managing it short-handed and it's showing that, but the underlying stock is solid." Another pause. "The hay yield I can't promise you anything about. That's weather." He nodded. It was the nod of a man who had made peace, imperfectly, with the things he couldn't control. "What do you want from Thursday?" she asked. "I want them to see a ranch that knows what it's doing." "Then show them. You don't need it to be perfect. You need it to be honest." She started toward the barn door and then stopped. How many head do you need to show them? 30 would be better than 28. The 2 strays I haven't recovered yet. I know where they are, Sarah said. He looked at her. East fence past the second ridge. There's a stand of cottonwood there where the grass comes in good in spring. I saw tracks 4 days ago when I was checking the fence line. She paused. I was going to mention it when I had a chance to look more closely. I can go tomorrow morning. Jack looked at her for a long moment in the fading light. How long have you known? He asked, and there was something careful in the way he asked it. 4 days? Why didn't you say? I wanted to be sure before I said. I don't like putting things in front of people that I'm not sure of. She looked at him steadily. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry for that. He stood there, and she could see him taking that in. The apology, which was direct, and the explanation, which was also direct, and the particular quality of both, which was that neither of them was performing anything. Go tomorrow, he said. Take Tommy. All right? She walked out into the evening, which had gone purple and cool, and she heard him behind her, standing in the barn door for a moment before he went somewhere else. The 2 strays were where she'd thought they'd be. She and Tommy found them before 8 in the morning, standing in the cottonwood shade with the undisturbed calm of cattle who have concluded that their current situation is adequate and see no particular reason to change it. Getting them back was more an exercise in patience than an effort. You couldn't push cattle like this. You had to offer them a reason to move and then give them the time to decide they wanted to. Tommy was good at this, it turned out. He had a quality of stillness that was unusual in someone his age, a capacity to slow himself down and match the tempo of what he was working with rather than imposing his own. Where'd you learn to move cattle like that? Sarah asked as they were walking the 2 strays back along the ridge. My uncle's place in Wyoming, Tommy said. I was there from about 12 to 16. He wasn't much for talking, but he was patient with animals. I think I just got that from being around him long enough. Good thing to get. He wasn't good at much else, Tommy said, not unkindly, just factually. But that he had. She nodded. People were like that, good at specific things and less good at others, and the mistake was in expecting the specific thing to spread outward and cover everything else. They had the strays back in the main pasture by 10, and Jack saw them come in from the equipment shed where he'd been working. He didn't say anything. He raised a hand, a brief gesture, acknowledgement, and went back to what he was doing. Tommy looked at Sarah. That's basically a party from him, he said. The bank man's name was Aldous Renner, and he arrived Thursday morning in a buckboard with a younger man who wrote things in a notebook and didn't appear to have a name, or at least not one that was introduced. Renner was a careful dresser in a way that looked deliberate, as if he'd thought about impressions. His boots had seen actual mud before today. Sarah noticed this, which meant he wasn't purely a town man. He walked the property with Jack, and Sarah went with them because Jack had asked her to, not to speak particularly, just to be there. She understood the reasoning. A ranch with a competent hands-on operation looked different from a ranch that was running on the owner's hope and determination alone. She stood near the fence line while Jack explained the repair plan, and Renner listened and looked at the new corner posts that were going in. They'd started on the first section the day before, and the steel posts were in properly set, and he looked at them for a long time. Who designed the repair approach? Renner asked. Sarah Whitmore, Jack said. Renner looked at her, not with hostility, with the particular attention of a man recalibrating his categories. The woman from the feed store. Sarah looked at him. I don't know what you mean. Pierce mentioned you came through, said you looked at his horses. He paused. He was sorry he didn't take you on, said so after. She had no memory of a Pierce at the feed store, but she said nothing about that. The fence approach is correct, she said. The soil in this section expands significantly with moisture variation. The original post didn't account for it. Steel corners properly set will solve the problem permanently. Renner looked back at the posts. And the herd? Recovering. You had a brief illness passing through. 3 animals. They're isolated and responding well. The main herd is 30 animals in good condition. 32, Jack said quietly. We recovered 2 strays. Renner wrote something in his own notebook, separate from the younger man with no name, and looked at the pasture where the cattle were visible in the morning light. "The ranch is viable," Renner said. It wasn't a question. He was putting something on record. "Yes," Jack said. Renner looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had seen a lot of ranches that were not viable and knew the difference. "I'll need to see the hayfield." "I'll take you." They walked toward the east field, and Sarah didn't go with them. She'd done what she was there to do. She went back to the barn and checked on the 3 isolated cattle, who were, unmistakably, doing better. Appetite returning, the respiratory sounds quieter. And she stood in the pen and felt the quiet satisfaction of a thing going the right direction. What changed with Hattie was slow, the way real changes usually are, and it happened without any single moment that could be pointed to. It started with the tea Sarah left on the stove every morning. It continued with the bread Hattie left covered on the table. Then there was a morning when Sarah came in from the fence line with mud on her boots and her hands cold from the early air, and Hattie was already at the kitchen table with her own tea, and she poured a second cup and pushed it across without being asked, and without a word, and Sarah sat down and drank it, and they sat together in the kitchen quiet for 10 minutes, and neither of them said a thing. It was the kind of silence you had to earn. Sarah knew that. On a Saturday afternoon, she was on the porch mending a piece of harness, a task that needed doing and that she'd taken on because no one else had, when Hattie came out and lowered herself into the other chair with the careful process she used for chairs that weren't exactly the right height. She had her knitting. She didn't look at Sarah. They worked in parallel for 20 minutes. "Your mother," Hattie said. Not an accusation, just a door cracking open. "She died when I was 17, Sarah said. "Fever." "And your father?" "He was gone before that. It wasn't a close family." Hattie knitted 3 stitches. "I had a daughter," she said, "between Jack's father and his uncle. She was born too small, and she lived 9 days. Sarah put down the harness for a moment. "I'm sorry." "It was a long time ago." Hattie's needles kept moving, which was its own kind of stoicism. "The frontier takes things," she said. "You think it gets easier to watch, and it doesn't. You just get better at standing up after." Sarah picked up the harness again. "That's an accurate description," she said. Hattie looked at her then, for the first time since sitting down. A long, clear look. "You've been standing up for a while," she said. It was not pity, it was recognition, which was entirely different. "Yes," Sarah said. Hattie went back to her knitting. Sarah went back to the harness. After another few minutes, Hattie said without looking up, "You made the cornbread for supper last Wednesday." Sarah had, in fact, made the cornbread last Wednesday when Deacon had been occupied with a repair that ran long. "Yes." "It was all right," Hattie said. Coming from Hattie Callaway, this was not faint praise. This was something close to endorsement. Sarah understood this and received it accordingly. "I'll make it again sometime," she said. Said Hattie. It was Jack who surprised her. 2 weeks in, she'd settled into the rhythms well enough that she was useful rather than merely present, and she'd stopped counting the days the way she had that first week. The fence repair was half done. The sick cattle were back with the main herd. The bank visit had gone well enough that Renner had extended the note by 4 months, which wasn't everything but was enough to work with. She was in the equipment shed one evening, late, looking at the mower that had been giving trouble, a problem with the blade mechanism that Deacon had written off as needing apart from town, but which Sarah suspected was actually a matter of adjustment rather than replacement. She had it partially disassembled and was working through it with the particular focus of someone who has forgotten what time is. She heard Jack in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Mower," she said. He came in and crouched down beside her and looked at what she had open. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated because he was actually looking rather than just reacting. "Deacon said it needs a new blade bracket." "The bracket is fine," she said. "The adjustment bolt has backed off. Look." She showed him, pointing to the specific place where the thread had worked loose over time. "Someone should have caught this in the last service. If you tighten it properly and use a lock washer, it won't do it again." He looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her. "You do this a lot?" he asked. "Look at things other people have given up on." "It's just looking," she said. Most things that seem broken aren't. They've just been mislabeled. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his expression that was different from the usual contained, working toward something look. Something more open and more uncertain, and she recognized it as the expression of a man who was thinking about something that wasn't directly in front of him. "My wife used to say I gave up on things too fast," he said. He said it carefully, the way you said something for the first time out loud when you'd been carrying it silently for a while. She wasn't wrong, mostly. Sarah said nothing. She recognized this wasn't a conversation that needed a response so much as it needed a space to be set into. She died of something the doctor called a lung fever, he said. 2 years and 4 months ago. She was 31. He paused. I'm telling you this because I think you've probably heard some version of it from Tommy or Deacon, and because it explains things about this ranch that are harder to explain otherwise. Tommy mentioned something, Sarah said. Not much. The ranch started going sideways about 6 months after. He looked at the mower without seeming to see it. I wasn't paying attention to it the way I should have been. I was paying attention to... He stopped and started a different direction. I was somewhere else for a while. That's understandable, Sarah said. It's expensive, he said. The word came out with a dry, self-critical edge. Grief is expensive when you have a ranch. She sat back on her heels and looked at him, and he was looking at the floor of the equipment shed with the expression of a man who had said something more honest than he'd meant to and wasn't sure what to do with that now. I think you're paying attention now, she said. He looked up at her. The light in the shed was the single lantern she'd hung from the roof beam, and it was the kind of light that showed things plainly. I think so too, he said. More than I was. He got up then, and she went back to the mower, and he stood for a moment in the doorway with one hand on the frame. Thank you, he said, for the mower, and for the other things. She didn't make anything of it. Good night, Jack, she said. He went. She finished the adjustment on the mower and tightened the bolt and used the lock washer she'd found in the parts bin. And she reassembled everything and turned the mechanism through by hand, and it ran clean and smooth. She hung the lantern back on its hook and went to the barn to check the horses one last time. They were fine, all of them, Clover included, settling into their hay with the philosophical contentment of animals whose needs were met. And then she walked to the house under a sky that was more stars than dark. She stopped outside the back door for a moment and stood in the night air and listened to the ranch sounds. The far-off cattle, the creek, the particular silence that wasn't silence at all, but was just the sound of things living. She thought about what Jack had said in the equipment shed, about somewhere else for a while. She understood it. She had her own version of it, her own somewhere else, the years of being turned away from places that had ground something down in her until she wasn't sure what was left. She hadn't named it that, grief, because the losses had been accumulating for so long and in such unglamorous ways, not a single death but a slow erosion, and she hadn't thought the word applied. Maybe it did. Maybe it was just the same thing wearing different clothes. She pushed the back door open and went inside, careful to close it quietly so as not to wake Hattie, and she moved through the dark kitchen by memory now. Already she knew where the table edge was, where the stove stood, where the floor creaked, and she went to her room and sat on the edge of the cot. She didn't think, this is home. She wasn't ready for that, and she knew it. What she thought was, this is worth staying for. See if it still is tomorrow. She lay down, and above her the window showed a rectangle of stars, and the ranch settled around her the way it had every night since she arrived, its sounds and its silences sorting themselves into something she was starting, without quite deciding to know by heart. The trouble started the way trouble usually did in small towns, not with a single moment, but with an accumulation of small ones, each individually dismissible, until the weight of them became something that couldn't be ignored. It began with a look Sarah got from the woman behind the counter at the general store when she came in with Jack to pick up wire for the fence repair. Not a hostile look exactly, more the careful, measuring kind that people gave when they were doing arithmetic in their heads and weren't sure yet what the sum was. Sarah had received looks like this before and had learned to file them under things that might mean nothing and move on. She moved on. Then there was the Sunday when Jack drove Hattie into town for her monthly visit with the doctor, a ritual Hattie submitted to with the resignation of someone who considered the entire enterprise unnecessary but had agreed to it as a concession to Jack's worry. And Sarah stayed at the ranch and did the work that needed doing, which was most of it. When they came back, Hattie had a particular set to her mouth that meant she was holding something in, and Jack had the kind of silence around him that wasn't his usual contained quiet, but something tighter. He didn't tell her what had been said in town. She didn't ask. But she noticed that night at supper that Hattie looked at her differently, not with less warmth, which had grown slowly into something real between them, but with a new layer of something protective underneath it, like a woman who had heard something and was deciding what to do with it. The third thing was Rafe. Rafe was the quieter of the two older hands, the one who had acknowledged her without warmth that first day and had never particularly warmed since, but who had been professional about it, doing his work, not making things difficult, maintaining the functional neutrality of a man who had learned to coexist with things he hadn't chosen. That had been fine. Sarah had worked with people who didn't like her before, and had found that shared work created its own kind of peace if everyone kept their standards up. But one morning she came into the barn to find Rafe talking to a man she didn't know, a thick-set man in a clean shirt who had the look of someone from town rather than someone who worked land. And when she walked in, the conversation stopped with a speed that meant something. Rafe looked at her. "Morning," he said, which was more words than he usually managed before noon. The other man looked at her with the specific quality of attention that people gave to things they'd already formed opinions about. Then he put his hat on and walked out of the barn without speaking to her at all. She watched him go. Then she looked at Rafe. "Who was that?" "Neighbor," Rafe said, and went back to what he'd been doing. She let it sit. She had enough to do without pulling on threads that might unravel things in ways she didn't have the time to manage. But she was not naive about what was happening. She had lived on the frontier long enough to understand its social mechanics. The way that a woman alone, unmarried, living on a man's ranch, became a story that other people felt entitled to tell. She had encountered versions of it in 3 of the 6 places she'd worked. She'd thought, maybe foolishly, that she'd walked into this one carefully enough to avoid it, that her competence and her conduct and the straightforward nature of the arrangement would speak for themselves. She was starting to think she'd been optimistic. It was Tommy who finally said it plainly. He came to find her one afternoon while she was working on the hay equipment, the kind of conversation that started with him loitering near the shed door for a while and pretending to do something with a fence post until she acknowledged that she saw him. "There's talk in town," he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment, clearly having prepared for more resistance. "You know? I've been watching it build for 2 weeks." She kept her hands on the equipment. "What are they saying exactly?" Tommy shifted his weight. He was 19 and honest and didn't have the equipment yet to carry information like this without it costing him something. "That it's not right," he said. "You being here, that it—" He stopped. "They're saying it looks like more than it is." She thought about that for a moment, about the particular cruelty of how that worked, the way that a woman's competence was automatically suspect, the way that every practical arrangement between a man and an unmarried woman got translated by certain people into the version that confirmed what they already believed. "What does Deacon think?" she asked. Tommy's expression told her before he answered. "Deacon doesn't— he hasn't said it to me directly, but he was in town Wednesday, and when he came back he wasn't—" He searched for the word. "He wasn't the same." So that was it. Deacon had heard something, and Deacon, who already had his reservations about her, had found those reservations confirmed by other people's bad thinking. That was the way of it. You could do everything right, and it didn't matter if the story was already being told. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I mean that." "What are you going to do?" She set down the tool she was holding. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. She'd made a rule for herself about not answering questions like that until she'd thought about them properly, and she hadn't had the chance to think about this one. She found out what Deacon thought that evening. She'd come back from checking the cattle and was washing her hands at the pump when she heard voices from inside the barn. Jack and Deacon. Not shouting, but not quiet either. The particular register of 2 men who had a real disagreement and were trying to stay on the right side of it. She didn't intend to listen. She started walking toward the house and then heard her own name and stopped, which was a human response that she didn't try to justify to herself. "Not saying she's a bad worker," Deacon was saying. "I'm saying it doesn't look right. It hasn't looked right since the beginning, and now the whole town's talking about it." "The town can mind its own concerns," Jack said. His voice was even, which meant he was working to keep it that way. "It's not that simple, and you know it. You've got a note with the bank. You've got a name in this valley that your family has been building for 30 years. And you've got a woman living in this house who isn't your wife and isn't your kin, and folks are drawing their own conclusions." A pause. "You telling me to let her go?" Jack said. "I'm telling you to think about what you're building and whether you can afford to have people talking about it the way they're talking." Deacon's voice had the particular roughness of a man who believed what he was saying and was uncomfortable saying it. "She's capable, I'll give her that. What she did with that yearling, I was wrong about that. I'm not too proud to say so, but capable doesn't fix what's happening in town." "What is happening in town?" Jack said, and it was not quite a question. "Renners heard it. That man from the Sutton property who came out here last week, he's on the Merchant Council, Jack. The same council that has 2 members on the bank's local advisory board. It gets around." A pause. "He came to look at her." Sarah felt something cold move through her. The man in the barn. The thick-set man in the clean shirt who had looked at her as if he already had his verdict. "Her name is Sarah Whitmore, and she has been doing the work of 3 people on this ranch for 6 weeks, Jack said. "I know that." "Then what exactly are you asking me to do?" A longer pause this time. "I don't know," Deacon said, and the honesty in it was almost worse than the accusation. "I'm telling you what I know, and what I know is that it's getting complicated, and complicated costs things out here." A pause. "You already know what it costs. You've been paying it for 2 years. She walked to the house. She went to her room and sat on the cot, not dramatically, just sitting down because she needed to be still. The light through the east window was going orange and low, and the sounds of the evening were beginning. The cattle, the creek, the particular quality of the air as the heat started coming out of it. She thought about what Deacon had said and what it meant. She had done this before. Worked herself into a place, found some purchase there, made herself necessary, and then watched the thing that was not about her competence at all sweep everything sideways. The 6th town. The 5th. Before that. The pattern of it was so familiar it was almost clarifying. It's like looking at a map you'd seen before and recognizing where you were. She could leave. She knew how to leave. She'd done it enough times that she had the mechanics of it down. The packing, the brief accounting of what was owed versus what was paid, the morning ride out of a place that had decided she was a problem rather than a person. She could do that here. She could save Jack the difficulty of the conversation, save herself the slower erosion of watching it get worse, and be gone before the bank made it into something official and damaging. The part of her that had learned to protect itself by moving said, "You know how this ends. Leave before it does." But there was another part, one that was newer and less well-practiced, that sat on the cot in the room that smelled like cedar and dried herbs and said, "You have not done anything wrong, not one thing. And this place is not wrong either, and the people in it are not wrong, and leaving because someone else's bad thinking is getting louder is a different thing from leaving because it's time to go." She didn't know which part was right. She sat there long enough for the light to go out of the window entirely, and she still didn't know. Dosmet. Hattie knocked on her door at 9 that evening. She never came to Sarah's room. Their relationship had developed in the shared spaces of the house. The kitchen, the porch, the occasional afternoon where they ended up occupying the same room by convergence rather than plan. This was different. Sarah opened the door. Hattie was in her nightclothes with her shawl over them and her cane, and her hair was down, which Sarah had never seen before, gray and long, and making her look somehow both older and younger at once. Her face in the lamplight from the hallway was clear of the particular armor she wore during the day. "You heard," Hattie said. Not a question. "Some of it," Sarah said. Hattie looked at her for a moment. "Can I come in?" Sarah stepped back and Hattie came in and looked at the room. The sparse arrangement of it, The small things on the shelf, the packed bag sitting in the corner that Sarah had not consciously put there, but had apparently moved at some point in the last hour. Hattie looked at the bag. Then she looked at Sarah. "You're thinking about leaving," Hattie said. "I'm thinking about what's best for the ranch," Sarah said carefully. "That's not what I asked." A silence. Sarah sat on the cot, and Hattie lowered herself into the room's single chair with the slow process that she brought to all chairs. "I have something to tell you," Hattie said, "and I need you to let me say all of it before you say anything." She settled the shawl around her shoulders. "When Jack brought you here, I was angry about it. Not because of you specifically. I didn't know you yet, because he hadn't asked me, and because I am old enough that people have stopped asking me about things that affect my life, and I had opinions about that." "I know," Sarah said. "Let me finish." Hattie's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "I was also afraid, not of you, of what you might leave behind when you went, because everyone leaves, and this house has had enough of that to last several lifetimes." She looked at the window. "My son died here. Jack's mother left. Not died, left, which is its own kind of wound. Jack's wife died. Tommy will go eventually, they all do, and Deacon will go when his back gives out entirely, and he can't do the work anymore, and I have been watching things leave this house for 30 years. She stopped. "I watched you," she said, "not because I was looking for reasons to push you out, because I needed to know what you were, whether you were the kind of person who was just passing through or the kind of person who—" She stopped again, and the pause had something in it that Jack Callaway, who was not given to visible struggle, was visibly struggling with. The kind of person who could stay. Sarah said nothing. Her throat was doing something that she was managing. "You are that kind," Hattie said flatly, like a fact being put on record. "Whatever else is happening in town, whatever those people are saying, you are the kind of person who could stay. And I am not going to sit in this house and watch you pack that bag, because some people in Caldwell Crossing have empty hours and smaller minds." She put both hands on her cane and looked at Sarah directly. "I am 72 years old," she said. "I have buried more things than I can count, and I have kept standing. And I need you to hear me say this clearly. I need you to stay. Not for Jack, though Jack needs it too, and is too careful to say so. For me." Her jaw moved. "I am asking you, and I don't ask for things." Sarah looked at the old woman in the chair and felt something shift in her chest that was painful in the specific way that relief sometimes was. Too big, too sudden, arriving in a place that had been braced against it. "I wasn't fully decided," Sarah said. "I know," Hattie said. "That's why I came." A silence settled between them. Outside, the ranch was quiet. The deep quiet of late evening when the day's work was fully done and the nighttime work hadn't started. "If I stay," Sarah said slowly, "the bank situation gets worse before it gets better. Whatever is being said in town, let it be said." "Hattie." "I know what it costs," the old woman said, and her voice had iron in it. "I lived in this valley when my husband was building this ranch, and people said things about us too, that we didn't belong, that the land was wrong for us, that we'd fail inside a year. We didn't fail." She looked at Sarah steadily. "The answer to people saying things about you is not to leave. The answer is to still be standing after." Sarah thought about what it meant to have someone say that to you, not as comfort, not as reassurance, but as a statement of something they had lived and found to be true. "I'll stay," Sarah said. Hattie nodded once, the nod of a matter settled. She made the process of getting up from the chair look harder than she would have wanted it to look, and Sarah stood and offered her arm without making anything of it, and Hattie took it without making anything of it either. They went to the door. "One more thing," Hattie said at the doorway. "Jack doesn't know I came here, and you won't tell him." "No," Sarah said. Hattie looked at her one more time with those quick, clear eyes. "Good night, Sarah." "Good night, Hattie." Jack. What happened 3 days later changed things in a way that none of them had anticipated. The letter arrived from the bank, not from Renner directly. It had been written by someone above Renner, which was itself a signal. It said, in the careful language of institutions that had learned to say difficult things without quite saying them, that the bank was reviewing the terms of the existing extension in light of new information regarding the operational and reputational standing of the property, and that a formal review would be conducted at the bank's offices within 2 weeks. Jack read it at the kitchen table with the stillness of a man absorbing something he'd expected and hadn't wanted to be right about. Then he folded it and set it on the table. Hattie was across from him. She looked at the letter and then at Jack and said nothing, which was its own statement. Sarah was at the stove and she heard the silence change quality when he put the letter down, and she turned. "May I read it?" she asked. He slid it across the table. She read it twice. The language was designed to be deniable. Nowhere did it say her name. Nowhere did it say what the new information was. But the timing was precise, and she was not going to pretend she didn't understand what it was about. "This is because of me," she said. "This is because some people in this town have more time than sense," Jack said. His voice was controlled, but barely. "That's true, and it still means it's because of me." She sat down at the table. "What happens if the bank pulls the note?" He looked at her steadily. "I have 60 days before I'd have to make decisions I don't want to make." "Can you fight it?" "On what grounds?" "They can call it a business review. They've done it to other ranches." "Well," he put his hands flat on the table. "If I go in there with nothing but my word against whatever they've been told, I lose." "Then don't go with nothing," Sarah said. He looked at her. "You go with the work," she said. "You go with the fence repairs and the herd numbers and the hay yield projections and the mower that's running again and the 2 strays that came home and the 3 sick cattle that recovered." She met his eyes. "You go with everything that has actually happened on this ranch in the past 6 weeks, and you put it in front of them and let them weigh it against whatever story someone has been telling." "Sarah Amich, I'm not finished." She kept her voice level. "And if the question is whether my presence here has hurt the ranch, then we answer that question honestly. We say what I do here and what this ranch was 6 weeks ago and what it is now, and we let the numbers speak." She paused. "But I'm not going to be the reason you lose this land. If we can't make the case, I'll—" "No," Jack said. Just the one word. Flat and final. She looked at him. "That is not a solution," he said, "and I'm not going to treat it like one." The kitchen was very quiet. Hattie's hands were on the table, but still. "Then what are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to think about it," Jack said, "and I'm going to need a day to think about it without making decisions I'll regret." He picked up the letter and folded it again and put it in his shirt pocket and stood up and went outside, and the door closed behind him with a careful quietness that was somehow worse than if he'd slammed it. Hattie looked at Sarah. "Let him think," she said. Sarah sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed through the feeling in her chest, which was complicated and had too many parts to name. Guilt was there, though she'd done nothing wrong. Anger was there, old anger, the kind she'd been carrying for years, the kind that came from a world that kept making her responsible for other people's bad thinking. And underneath both of those was something that was almost fear, not for herself but for this place and the people in it, which was new. She hadn't been afraid for a place in a long time. That fear told her something she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Jack came back that evening before supper and found Sarah in the equipment shed, not working on anything particular, just sitting on an upturned crate in the fading light. He came in and sat on the other crate they kept in there for reasons that had never been explained to her and had clearly been there a long time. They sat for a moment without speaking. "The town meeting is in 10 days, Jack said. Second Thursday of the month. Half the valley comes in." "I know," she said. Tommy had mentioned it. "I want to go," Jack said. "Not to defend myself to them. I don't owe anyone a defense for running my ranch the way I choose." He stopped. "But the bank listens to the merchant council, and the merchant council will be there. And if there's going to be talk—" He looked at his hands. "I'd rather it be talk that happens in front of me than behind me." "And me?" Sarah said. She meant the question plainly. What did he want from her at this? He looked up. "I want you there," he said, "if you're willing." She considered that. What it meant to walk into a room where people had been constructing a version of her without her input, and to stand in front of that and let it be whatever it was going to be. It was not a small thing. She had done versions of it before, and they had cost her things. She had walked out of rooms like that with less than she'd walked in with. She knew the weight of it. But she thought of Hattie saying, "The answer is to still be standing after." And she thought of the ranch in the early morning, the fence line and the cattle and the creek and the east window in her room, and she thought of the specific true thing that had been growing here over 6 weeks that she didn't have a name for but was real. "I'm willing," she said. Jack nodded. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to be able to read, the open, undefended version of him that appeared sometimes in the evenings without the daytime containment. "I want to say something," he said, "and I need you to let me say it badly because I don't know how to say it well." She waited. "You came here with nothing," he said to him. $11 and a borrowed horse and a bag with a broken strap. "And in 6 weeks you have done more for this ranch than—" He stopped and started again. "I didn't hire you. I asked you, and you said yes. And I want you to know that I understand what it cost you to say yes to something uncertain when you'd had so many uncertain things already." She didn't say anything. "Whatever happens with the bank and the town meeting and all of it," he said, "I need you to know that." He paused. "I'm not good at saying things like this. I'm telling you because it's true and because you deserve to hear it." The shed was very quiet. The last of the daylight was going. "Thank you," she said. It was simple, and it was not enough, and it was all she had. He stood up. "Supper's going to be late," he said, which was the most practical thing he could have said, and somehow that was right too. The turn back to the ordinary things, the way the ordinary things held everything else together. "I'll help Deacon," she said. She stood and they walked back to the house in the early dark, not quite side by side, not quite at a distance, in the particular proximity of two people who were still learning what they were to each other, and had decided for now that that was enough. Hattie was on the porch. She watched them come up from the shed without expression, but Sarah caught her eye as she came up the steps, and Hattie gave her one small nod. Not approval exactly, something older and more complicated than approval. Sarah went inside and tied on her apron and started helping with supper, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of the evening meal being made, the fire and the pots, and Deacon's particular silence, and the smell of something good cooking. And she stood at the stove and felt the weight of the coming 10 days settle onto her shoulders. She didn't put it down. It was hers to carry. But she stood up straight under it, the way Hattie had taught her without meaning to, and she cooked, and outside the window the first stars were coming out over the valley one at a time, slow and certain, the way things that were actually fixed always did. The 10 days before the town meeting were the kind that passed both too fast and too slow. Fast in the daylight, when there was enough work to keep the mind from circling, and slow in the evenings when the work was done and there was nothing left to do but sit with what was coming. Sarah kept to her routines, the fence line in the mornings, the herd check at midday, the equipment, and the evening feeding, and the small repairs that accumulated on any working ranch the way small debts did, steadily, without drama, until you either addressed them or didn't. She worked because working was what she knew how to do, and because the alternative was to spend those 10 days in her own head, which was not a place she trusted when things were uncertain. Jack worked harder than usual, which was saying something. He was in the fields before she was most mornings, which she'd thought wasn't possible, and he pushed through the hay equipment maintenance that had been deferred and checked every fence section she'd already repaired, as if he needed to see with his own hands that it was solid. He wasn't doubting her work. She understood that. He was doing what people did when they needed to know that the things they'd built were real, that they'd hold. Deacon was the harder question. He'd been quieter since the conversation she'd overheard in the barn, not the productive quiet of a man who had sorted something out, but the specific silence of someone sitting with a discomfort they hadn't resolved. He did his work. Deacon always did his work. That was bedrock in him. But there was a distance in it now that hadn't been there before. Or maybe had always been there, and she was only reading it differently now that she knew what he'd said. She found him alone one afternoon at the water trough, working on the pump mechanism that had been running rough. She crouched down on the other side of it and looked at what he was doing. "Seal's going," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't look up. She picked up the wrench from the ground near him and handed it across without being asked, because he needed it next and they both knew it. He took it. They worked on opposite sides of the pump for a few minutes in the tight, practical silence of two people fixing the same thing. "I heard you," she said. "In the barn, that night." His hands stilled for just a moment and then kept moving. "I figured." "I'm not asking you to take it back," she said. "You were saying what you thought was true. I can disagree with it without needing you to not have said it." He looked up at her then. His face was the face of a man who had spent a long time outdoors and showed it, and the expression on it was complicated, not hostile, not apologetic, something between the two. "I said you were capable," he said. "I know. That wasn't a small thing from me. I know that too." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for more than that. I just needed you to know I heard it." He went back to the pump. 2 more turns of the wrench and the mechanism seated properly, and when he ran the handle, the water came up clear and steady. "You're going to the meeting," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He looked at the water running into the trough. "Then I'll be there too," he said. Not warmly, not as an offer of alliance, just as a fact he was putting down. She nodded and stood and walked back toward the barn. And she didn't look back, but something in her chest had eased slightly. Not resolved, just eased, which was the most she'd expected. Matin. Hattie spent the 3 days before the meeting doing something Sarah hadn't seen her do before, writing letters. She sat at the kitchen table in the afternoons with her good pen and a stack of paper that she'd asked Jack to bring from town, and she wrote with the concentration of a woman who had a specific accounting to make and intended to make it correctly. She didn't explain what she was writing, and Sarah didn't ask. On the evening before the meeting, Hattie called Sarah into the kitchen and showed her 4 finished letters, folded and sealed. "I wrote to Renner," she said, "and to the 3 members of the Merchant Council that I have known long enough to write to directly." She put her hand flat on the stack of them. "I told them the truth about this ranch, and about you. Not to defend you. You don't need defending. To make the record accurate before anyone else gets to make it for them." Sarah looked at the letters. "You didn't have to do that." "I didn't do it because I had to," Hattie said, with the particular edge she used when people misread her motives. "I did it because it was right, and because I have known those men for 20 years, and they will take a letter from me seriously in a way they would not take other things." She paused. "My name still means something in this valley. I don't use it often. This seemed like the occasion." Sarah stood in the kitchen and felt the specific, uncomfortable weight of being cared for by someone she cared about, the way it was harder to receive than to give, how it required a different kind of standing still. "Thank you, Hattie," she said. Hattie picked up the letters and handed them to her. "Make sure Jack posts these tonight. The morning mail goes out before the meeting." The morning of the second Thursday arrived gray and cooler than the days before it, the sky carrying the low, undecided cloud cover of early summer weather that couldn't commit to rain or sun and had settled on a sullen compromise between them. Sarah was up at 4:30, which was earlier than even her usual, not because there was more work, but because she couldn't sleep past it. She stood at the east window and watched the light come up slow and flat over the ridge, and thought about the various ways the day could go. She had done this before. She had walked into rooms that had already decided about her and tried to change the decision with the truth. And sometimes it had worked and sometimes it hadn't. She didn't know which this would be. She wasn't going to pretend she did. What she knew was this: she had done her work honestly. The fence sections were repaired properly and would hold. The herd was 32 animals in good condition. The hayfield was ahead of where it had been at this point last season, which Jack had told her after checking the records. The 3 sick cattle had recovered fully. The mower worked, the pump worked. The ranch was running better than it had run in 2 years, and there were 3 people and a young ranch hand who knew that and could say so. That was what she had. She didn't know if it would be enough. She went down to the kitchen and made coffee and sat with it in the quiet before anyone else was up, and she let herself feel, honestly and without managing it, the fear that was there. Not the performing calm version of herself that she sometimes used in rooms where she needed it. Just the actual feeling, sitting with it, the way you sat with a thing you couldn't fix, until it became something you'd made space for rather than something you were braced against. By the time Tommy came down at 6 and found her on the second cup, she felt something close to steady. "Big day," Tommy said, with the specific energy of 19. "Yes," she said. "You want some eggs?" "Please," she said. And that was enough of that. Barozen. They rode in together, Jack driving the wagon with Hattie in the seat beside him, Sarah and Tommy on horseback, Deacon on his own horse 10 yards back. Not in a formation, not with any deliberate symbolism, just the arrangement that made practical sense and happened to put them all moving in the same direction at the same time. Caldwell Crossing had more people in it than Sarah had seen since she arrived. The monthly meeting was a genuine event out here, a reason to come in from outlying properties, to settle accounts and catch up and attend to whatever civic business had accumulated. The hitching posts along the main street were nearly full. She could see faces in the doorways of the saloons, the particular posture of people who had opinions about the upcoming meeting and weren't sure yet whether to share them. Some of them looked at her. She'd known they would. She looked back. Not aggressively, not with anything that could be characterized as challenge. Just level, the same way she looked at anything she was willing to see clearly. The meeting was held in the larger of the town's 2 public buildings, a hall that was also used for auctions and the occasional dance and twice a year for a traveling doctor, which accounted for its slightly peculiar smell of sawdust and liniment. The wooden chairs had been arranged in rows facing a long table at the front where the merchant council sat. 5 men, all of them past 50, all of them with the settled weight of local authority that accumulated on men who'd been in the same place long enough. The thick-set man who had come to the barn, she'd learned his name by now, Clement Hazard, which seemed almost too on the nose, was third from the left. He watched her come in with the expression of a man who had written a story and was waiting to see if reality would confirm it. Sarah sat in the 3rd row. Jack sat beside her, and Hattie took the aisle seat that allowed her cane the room it needed. Tommy sat behind them, and Deacon, she noticed this, took a seat in the 2nd row, one position up from her, without appearing to have made any decision about it at all. The hall filled. She recognized some faces from her trips into town for supplies. Others were strangers. All of them, or nearly all, had looked at her at least once since she'd walked in. Aldous Renner was there. He was sitting off to the side, not at the council table, observer's territory, which meant he was here in some capacity that wasn't quite official. He'd nodded briefly when she came in, which she filed away. The meeting began with the routine things: road maintenance, a dispute about water rights on a property to the north of town, the schedule for the summer market. Sarah sat through all of it, with her hands in her lap and her back straight, the way she sat through most things she had to wait for. Then Clement Hazard leaned forward and set his elbows on the table and said, "I'd like to raise the matter of the Callaway property." The room's quality of attention changed immediately. The particular alertness of people who've been waiting for the real thing to start. As council members, we have a responsibility to the integrity of this community's business relationships, Hazard said. He had the practiced cadence of a man who had run meetings before. There have been concerns raised about the current operating arrangement at the Callaway Ranch, specifically as it relates to the bank's assessment of the property's standing. He paused. I think it would be appropriate for that to be discussed openly. Jack was very still beside her. He told her the night before that he was going to let the accusations take their shape before he responded to them, because you couldn't fight the shape of something until you could see it clearly. "What concerns?" said a woman's voice from somewhere in the back. Sarah turned. An older woman, gray-haired, with the look of someone who ran her own land. The arrangement of having an unmarried woman residing on the property without appropriate oversight, or— "What does appropriate oversight mean?" the woman in the back asked. Hazard's cadence slipped slightly. "The community has standards." "Whose standards?" said the woman. It wasn't quite a question. A murmur moved through the room. Not all of it hostile to Hazard, but not all of it in his favor either. Sarah watched and said nothing. Hazard reset himself. The point is that questions have been raised about the reputational standing of the Callaway Ranch, and those questions have bearing on the bank's assessment, and— "I'd like to speak," said Hattie. The room went quiet in a different way. Hattie Callaway was not someone many people in this valley interrupted. She stood, which cost her something. Sarah could see that, the careful straightening, the hand on the cane, but she stood fully and looked at the council table with the expression of a woman who had been waiting her turn and considered the wait complete. I have lived in this valley for 41 years, she said. Her voice was clear. Age had not softened it. I have known 3 of the 5 men at that table for more than 20 of those years. I want to speak about what is actually happening at the Callaway Ranch because I live there, and I think that makes me a reliable witness. Hazard opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Hattie said without looking at him. She told them about the fence, about the soil problem that had been there since the beginning and had never been properly diagnosed until Sarah walked the line and identified it. She told them about the herd, the sick cattle that were caught early and treated and recovered, the 2 strays that were found and brought home. She told them about the mower and the pump and the hay yield. She told them the numbers, the specific, actual numbers, because Hattie had been listening and calculating this whole time with the precision of a woman who had kept the books on a working ranch for 30 years. The ranch is in better condition than it has been in 2 years, she said. I will put my name to that statement in writing for any institution that requires it. She paused. And I want to say one more thing. She looked directly at Clement Hazard. I was not an easy woman to come to. I am not now, and I was not then. When Sarah Whitmore arrived at my grandson's ranch, I watched her with the specific intention of finding a reason to have her removed, because I have seen people come and go from that house, and I have learned to protect myself from the ones who will leave. She stopped. She stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had made it clear she would leave if she needed to. She stayed because the work was real, and she does real work. And she stayed because she looked after me in ways I did not ask for, and would not have accepted if I'd been offered them directly. Something moved through the room. Not sound exactly, more like a collective shift, the way a field of grain moved when the wind changed. The question of this woman's presence on my grandson's ranch is not a matter of community standards, Hattie said. It is a matter of whether this community can tell the difference between a person's reputation and their character. Those are not the same thing. She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Tommy stood up. He was the youngest person in the hall by at least 10 years, and he stood with the visible awkwardness of someone who had decided to do something before they'd worked out how, but he stood. My name is Tommy Briggs, he said to the room, because most of them didn't know him. I've been at the Callaway Ranch since last autumn. I want to talk about the yearling. He told the story plainly, not embellished, not with the drama that 19 sometimes added to things. He told it the way he'd lived it. The ditch, the animal in distress, the disagreement about how to approach it, Sarah's decision to go in herself, the outcome. He told it as a sequence of events. She was right, he said. I don't know if it matters to you, but she was right about what needed doing, and she did it, and the animal is fine. That's the kind of person she is. He sat down with the abruptness of someone who had said everything they had and didn't want to add to it. In the second row, Deacon shifted in his seat. Sarah felt it more than saw it, a movement, a settling, the physical equivalent of a decision being made. He put his hands on his knees and straightened, and then, in the particular way of a man who had been sitting still too long, he stood. The room looked at him. Deacon was known here. 11 years at the Callaway Ranch meant he was part of the valley's furniture in the way that Tommy wasn't yet. I told Jack that Sarah's presence was causing problems for the ranch, Deacon said. He said it without preamble because Deacon had never been a man for preamble. I said that in private, and I'll say it here because I said it, and it's the honest record. He paused. I was thinking about reputation. I wasn't thinking about what the ranch actually needed. Another pause. Longer. I've been on working ranches for 30 years. I know what a good hand looks like, and I know what a poor one does, and I've been watching Sarah Whitmore for 6 weeks. She is the best I've seen at what she does. I was wrong to weigh that against what people were saying. That's all I've got. He sat down. The room was very quiet. Clement Hazard looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man whose story had been revised in real time and wasn't sure what he had left. He started to say something about community standards and the bank's position, but it had the quality of a reflex rather than a conviction, and it faded out before it fully formed. The council member at the far left of the table, a man Sarah didn't know named Grantley, who had said nothing until now, cleared his throat. I'd like to ask Miss Whitmore a question, if she's willing. Sarah stood. Grantley looked at her with the direct attention of a man who formed his opinions slowly and didn't let them be shaped by other people's noise. How long do you intend to stay at the Callaway Ranch? The room held itself. She thought about the question. She thought about what she'd felt riding in this morning, the valley opening up around them, the particular smell of the grass after the cool night, the way the light had started coming through the cloud cover in long, slanted lines by the time they hit the main road. She thought about Hattie's hand on her arm on the porch steps. She thought about Jack in the equipment shed saying, "I want you to know that I understand what it cost you. As long as I'm needed and wanted," she said, which at present appears to be a while. Grantley nodded once, the nod of a man who found that sufficient. Then Sarah looked at Hazard. She hadn't planned to say what she said next. It came from a place that had been accumulating for 2 years, maybe longer, the specific and particular fatigue of being evaluated by people who hadn't looked at her long enough to know what they were looking at. "I have been turned away from 6 towns," she said. Not loudly, not with heat. Just clearly, the way you stated something true. Not because I couldn't do the work, because nobody wanted to take the time to find out. I came to Caldwell Crossing with $11 and a borrowed horse and the expectation that this place would be the 7th. Instead, a man I didn't know asked me to help him save his ranch, and I said yes, and I have done that work every day since. She looked around the room. I am not asking anyone here to like me. I am not asking anyone to revise their opinions about how things ought to be arranged. What I'm saying is that this valley has a working ranch that is producing more than it was 2 months ago, with better fences and a healthier herd and repaired equipment. And that is the reality regardless of what story anyone chooses to tell about how it happened. She paused. I was never asking to be hired. I was asking someone to see what I could actually do. Jack Callaway did. And I think, looking at some of you, that you can see it too. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that happened when something true had been said in front of enough people that it couldn't be unsaid. Renner walked to them afterward, while the hall was breaking up and people were filtering out into the gray morning. He had his notebook under his arm, and the expression of a man who had been paying close attention to the accounts all along and had arrived at a sum. "The formal review," he said to Jack. Jack looked at him. "I'll be recommending to the bank that the extension stand at its current terms," Renner said. "The operational record of the ranch is clear, and—" he glanced at Sarah. "And I believe the record speaks more accurately than the concerns that were raised." He paused. "I received a letter from Mrs. Callaway. She made the operational case with considerable precision." "Yes," Jack said. "She would." Renner looked at Sarah one more time. "Pierce asked me to tell you that if you ever find yourself looking for a change of situation, the offer stands." He said it neutrally, as information. I told him I thought that was unlikely. He walked away. Sarah stood in the doorway of the hall and looked at the main street of Caldwell Crossing in the flat morning light. The hitching posts and the stores and the people who were watching her with expressions that had changed, some of them, from what they'd been carrying when she'd walked in. Not all of them. Some faces still had the particular set of people who had decided something and weren't comfortable undeciding it. She didn't expect otherwise. But some of them were different. The gray-haired woman from the back of the room walked past her on the way out and paused. "Eleanor Marsh," she said by way of introduction. "I run the Marsh property, east of here. I've been looking for someone who knows livestock." She stopped there, not making it more than it was, and walked on. Sarah watched her go. Tommy appeared beside her with his hat in his hands, and the expression of someone who had done something they were proud of and was trying not to show it too obviously. "How do you think it went?" he asked. "Better than it could have," she said. "Do you think Hazard believes what he believes," she said. "That won't change today. But he's one person." She looked at the room, which was emptying now, chairs being pushed back, conversation starting. "One person's story about you is not the whole story. It just has to be countered with the true one." Tommy thought about this. "That's what you did in there." "We all did," she said. "That's not a one-person job." Hattie came up behind them, Jack at her elbow. She looked at Sarah with the expression she used when she had come to a conclusion she considered settled and didn't plan to revisit. "Well," Hattie said, "that's done." "Yes," Sarah said. Come on then, I want to get home before it rains. She started toward the door with the particular authority of a woman who had said everything necessary and found the rest of the morning irrelevant. Jack met Sarah's eyes over Hattie's head. A brief look, something warm in it that neither of them addressed. And then they both followed the old woman out into the street, where the clouds had finally made their decision and the first drops were beginning to come down. And Sarah turned her face up to them for just a moment, the rain cool and real and indifferent to everything that had just happened, which was exactly what she needed. Deacon was at the wagon, already holding the horse steady. He didn't look at her directly, but when she came up beside him, he handed her Clover's reins without being asked, which was its own kind of language, and she took them, and they stood there together in the rain while Jack got Hattie settled in the wagon, and the town of Caldwell Crossing moved around them with the ordinary business of a Thursday morning. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up. The valley opened ahead of them as they moved out of town. The road south, the creek, the ridge, and she rode into it with the feeling she hadn't trusted herself to name yet, but which was becoming harder to argue against, that she was not riding toward something uncertain anymore. She was riding home. The rain that started on the ride home didn't stop until the following morning. It came down through the night in the steady, purposeful way of rain that has made up its mind, and Sarah lay in her room listening to it work its way through the eaves and hit the ground outside her window and thought about what had happened in the hall that day. Not analyzing it. She'd done enough of that on the ride back, going over the faces and the words and the particular moment when the room's weight had shifted. She was past analysis now. She was just letting it settle, the way you let a hard day settle, not trying to make it into meaning before it was ready. What she kept coming back to was Deacon. Not Hattie, whose courage she'd expected, or Tommy, whose honesty she'd trusted, or Jack, whose steadiness had been the frame around all of it. Deacon, the man who had stood up in that room and said plainly that he had been wrong, without softening it or turning it into something more comfortable. That had cost him something real. She knew enough about men like Deacon to know that, and he'd paid it anyway. She thought about what it meant that he'd done that. Not for her sake, not exactly. For the sake of the true thing, because the true thing mattered to him more than the position he'd already taken, and that was rarer than people like to think. She fell asleep listening to the rain and slept better than she had in weeks. The days after the meeting were different, not dramatically. The ranch didn't suddenly transform. The work didn't change. The morning fence walks and the herd checks and the equipment maintenance all continued in their ordinary rhythm. But the quality of things shifted in ways that were small and real. Deacon passed her the coffee before she reached for it. Jack stopped censoring himself mid-sentence the way he sometimes had before, that slight hesitation she'd noticed when he was about to say something direct about her place on the ranch, and then thought better of it. Even the space between them at the kitchen table was different. Not smaller exactly, but easier, the way a room feels different after you've opened a window that's been stuck for a long time. Hattie was the most unchanged, which was fitting. She had always been what she was. The meeting had simply made it visible to other people. 3 days after, Eleanor Marsh rode out to the ranch. Sarah saw her coming down the south road from the fence line, where she was doing a follow-up inspection on the new corner posts, checking the set after the rain, making sure the ground hadn't shifted enough to matter. She watched the horse and rider come through the gate with the unhurried pace of someone who'd made a decision and wasn't reconsidering it. Eleanor Marsh was somewhere in her late 50s, with the direct manner of a woman who had been running her own property for long enough that she'd forgotten other people found it unusual. She had 200 acres east of the Callaway land and ran sheep, which was its own particular kind of work with its own particular challenges, and she'd been doing it since her husband died 15 years ago. "I meant what I said in town," she told Sarah, standing in the yard with her reins in her hand. "I'm looking for someone who knows animals. Not full-time, I can't afford that. But I've got a situation with 3 ewes that isn't resolving itself and I need a second opinion." "Tell me about the situation," Sarah said. Eleanor told her. It was a respiratory issue, similar pattern to what Sarah had caught in the Callaway herd, possibly the same thing moving through the valley's animals. And Eleanor had been managing it alone for 2 weeks without improvement. "I can come out Thursday," Sarah said, "if Jack can spare me for a morning." I already talked to Jack, Eleanor said. He said yes. Sarah looked at her. You talked to Jack first. I wanted to make sure it was workable before I put it to you. Eleanor said it without apology. I've been running a ranch alone for 15 years. I know better than to create problems before I've solved the logistics. Sarah respected this. Thursday, then, she said. Eleanor nodded and looked around the yard with the assessing gaze of a person who kept mental notes about other people's operations. The fence work is good, she said, looking at the corner posts. Better than good. Who designed the approach? I did, Sarah said. Eleanor looked at her. I've got a fence problem on my north line, she said. Same soil type over there as you've got on the south pasture. I'd pay for the consultation. We can talk about that Thursday, Sarah said. Eleanor left the way she'd come, without ceremony, without small talk, with the purposeful economy of a woman whose time was real and finite. Sarah watched her go and stood for a moment in the yard, feeling something she didn't immediately identify. It took her a minute. The feeling was possibility, not the desperate provisional kind she'd been carrying for 2 years, the kind that said, maybe this town, maybe this job, maybe this will be the one. Something quieter than that, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. She told Jack about the Thursday arrangement over supper. He listened and nodded. She pay fairly? He asked. We'll work it out. He looked at her across the table. You should charge what the work is worth, he said, not what you think people will accept. She looked at him. That's interesting advice from a man who spent 2 months undervaluing his own ranch to a bank. Tommy made a noise that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. Jack looked at him, and Tommy became very interested in his bread. That's fair, Jack said, back to Sarah. I know, she said. This was new between them. This ease, the ability to say a direct thing and have it land without all the careful handling that had surrounded their conversations before the meeting. It had happened gradually over those 10 days of preparation, and the meeting had finished the job. Whatever careful distance they'd been maintaining had become something else without either of them formally deciding to let it. Hattie watched all of this from her end of the table with the expression of a woman watching something she'd expected unfold at a pace she found reasonable. What? It was a Saturday evening, 2 weeks after the meeting, when Jack said what had been building for a while. Sarah was on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light go down behind the western ridge in the long, slow way it did in summer. Not dramatic, just a gradual withdrawal of color until the sky was a pale gray-green above the dark line of the hills. She heard the door and heard him come out and take the other chair, the one that had been Hattie's territory, but which Hattie had started vacating around this time of evening, which Sarah had begun to suspect was deliberate. They sat for a while without talking. This was one of the things she'd come to understand about Jack, that his silences were usually working silences, that something was happening in them, and that if you waited they would resolve themselves into words without needing to be prompted. I need to say something to you, he said. All right, she said. He looked at the ridge. I don't have a clean way to say it, so I'm going to say it directly, and you can tell me if I've read things wrong. That's fine. I don't want this to be an employer and employee situation anymore, he said. It hasn't felt like that for a while, and I think we both know it. But I needed the meeting to be finished, and I needed to know that you were staying because you wanted to stay, not because you didn't have another option. He paused. Eleanor's offer made that clear. You have another option, and you're still here. She looked at him. He was looking at the ridge, which was his way of saying something hard. Eyes somewhere neutral, voice doing the work. I'm still here, she said. Then I want to ask you something. And I want you to know that whatever you say, the answer about the ranch doesn't change. You have a place here regardless. I need you to know that first. I know it, she said. He looked at her then. The last of the evening light was in his face, the specific kind that showed things plainly. I'd like to know if there's a future where this is something more than what it is, he said. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm asking if it's something you'd be willing to think about. She sat with it for a moment. The honest answer was that she'd already been thinking about it, had been, in some form, since the equipment shed, since the evening he'd stood in her doorway saying things he didn't know how to say well. She'd been thinking about it and putting it away and taking it back out and putting it away again, The way you handled something you weren't sure you were allowed to keep. It's something I've been thinking about, she said. He let out a slow breath. Not relief exactly. The breath of a man who had been holding something carefully and could put it down for a moment. Then we'll think about it, he said. Yes, she said. We will. They sat on the porch until the light was fully gone, and the stars came out over the valley, and they didn't resolve anything that night. Didn't make promises or arrangements or any of the formal declarations that would come later. They just sat in the same space and let the evening do what evenings did, and that was enough for now, more than enough, because some things needed to grow at their own rate and didn't benefit from being hurried. But the letter from the bank came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the meeting. Sarah was in the barn when Jack brought it in from town, and she watched his face when he read it and knew before he said anything that it was the answer they'd needed. The extension was confirmed at existing terms. The review had been closed. Renner had appended a handwritten note, short, professional, in the economical style of a man who expressed himself in as few words as the situation required, saying that the operational record of the ranch had been found to be in good standing and that the bank looked forward to a continued relationship with the Callaway property. Jack read it twice, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. He stood in the barn for a moment with his hand on the pocket, and Sarah didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. This was private. The feeling of a thing you'd been fighting for finally stopping fighting back. You didn't narrate that. You just let it be there. Then he looked at her. The hay yield, he said. Deacon thinks we'll hit the August number. I think so too, she said. Maybe a little above. He nodded. The bank note is covered. Yes. Then we use what's above it to start on the barn roof, he said, because Jack Callaway, who had just received news that his family's land was not going to be taken from him, immediately began thinking about what needed fixing next, which was either a flaw or the defining quality of the man, depending on how you looked at it. She thought, honestly, that it was the defining quality. The south section first, she said. The ridge boards are worse. He looked at her. You've been up on the roof? I walked it last month. You were in town. You didn't tell me. I was going to tell you when I had the numbers on what the materials would cost. I wanted something concrete to bring you. He shook his head slowly, not in frustration, in the particular way of someone absorbing a person's habits. You always do that, he said. You wait until you have something solid. Yes. It's a good way to be, he said. It's also sometimes a longer road than necessary. She looked at him. Is that a comment about the roof or something else? His expression shifted. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to one. Could be both. She picked up the pitchfork she'd put down when he came in. South section first, she said. I'll have the numbers by Friday. Hattie's health, which had been the unspoken concern under everything all summer, did something in August that none of them had expected. It improved. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where someone who has been fading suddenly recovers to full capacity and everyone cries. It was more modest than that. Her mornings became shorter. The time she spent upstairs before coming down, which had been getting longer, started shortening again. The color in her face was better. She made it through full days without the particular exhaustion that had been taking her by 3 in the afternoon, and on a Wednesday in the middle of August, she came out to watch the hay cutting and stood there for 2 hours without needing to sit. Sarah had talked to the doctor, the traveling one who came through twice a year and who knew Hattie's case, and he said that sometimes people did this, that improvement was not always impossible and not always explainable, and that the best thing for it was the thing that appeared to already be happening, regular meals, activity within reason, and something to be interested in. She's interested in everything, Sarah said. That's good, he said simply. What Hattie was most visibly interested in was a garden. It had started as a conversation. Hattie had mentioned, in her sideways manner of mentioning things she actually wanted, that the south side of the house had good light and had once had a kitchen garden before certain events had made it impractical to maintain. Sarah had said that she'd been thinking about putting one in. Hattie had said that if someone were going to do that, they ought to do it properly, and she had opinions about properly. They started it together in the last week of July. Hattie directed from the low stool Sarah had set up near the edge of the bed, and Sarah dug and amended and planted, and Tommy helped with the heavier work when he wasn't needed elsewhere. And Deacon walked past it one morning and looked at it for a long moment, and then said, without being asked, that there was a better way to arrange the drainage and showed them, which was how Deacon contributed to most things, silently, by doing. By mid-August, the first beans were up and the tomatoes were flowering, and there was a row of herbs along the south wall that Hattie had planted herself, on her knees in the dirt, which Sarah had quietly made possible by engineering the whole arrangement so that section was the most accessible part of the bed. Hattie had not acknowledged this engineering directly. She had simply planted the herbs and later, inside, had made tea with the first of the dried ones and poured 2 cups without being asked and pushed one across the table. And that was how that went. Eleanor Marsh became something Sarah hadn't quite expected, a colleague, and eventually something approaching a friend. The Thursday consultation had extended into regular visits, and Sarah's work on Eleanor's sick ewes had resolved the issue inside 10 days. Same basic approach as the Callaway herd: isolation and treatment and careful observation. Eleanor had paid her fairly, more than fairly, and had then asked about the fence consultation, and that had led to work on Eleanor's north line over 2 mornings in early August. Word traveled the way it did out here, not through announcement, but through the specific channels of people who noticed things and mentioned them to other people who needed to know. By the end of the summer, Sarah had been consulted by 2 other ranchers in the valley, both with livestock problems, one with a fence situation. And she'd handled all of it in the time around her work at the Callaway Ranch, early mornings or half-days when things allowed. Jack said nothing about it for a while, and then one evening he said, "You're building something." "I'm just doing work people are asking for," she said. "Those are sometimes the same thing," he said. She thought about that. She hadn't framed it that way to herself, as building. She'd been thinking of it as useful, as practical, as what happened when you did your work honestly and people noticed. But Jack was right that there was a shape forming in it, something that hadn't existed 2 months ago and was becoming real. She was not a woman who had ever had a reputation worth mentioning, in the positive sense. Her reputation had always been the thing that preceded her into rooms and made people decide before they looked. A woman alone, without ties, without property, moving from place to place. The story told itself, and she'd never had the standing to argue with it effectively. Something different was happening now. She could feel it in the way Eleanor spoke to her and in the way the second rancher, a man named Burfield, had introduced her to his wife. "This is Sarah Whitmore." She sorted out the Dunmore heifer situation. Not by her relationship to Jack, not by what she was to the Callaway Ranch, by what she'd done. That was new. She didn't know what to do with it yet, other than keep doing the work. The proposal, if you could call it that, and Sarah was never entirely sure what to call it, happened in early September, in the equipment shed, which she found fitting. They'd been working late on the mower again. A different problem this time, a blade tension issue that was her fault, actually. She'd set it slightly wrong in the spring, and it had been wearing unevenly. And the evening had come down around them while they worked, the shed lit by 2 lanterns, the air outside cooling fast the way it did in September. Jack had been handing her tools without being asked for an hour, which was its own language between them by now, and she'd been talking through what she was doing the way she sometimes did, not for his benefit exactly, but because saying it helped her think. And he'd been listening the way he listened, contained and complete. She finished the adjustment and sat back and wiped her hands on the rag, and he was sitting on the upturned crate, looking at her with the open, undefended evening version of himself. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You said that once before," she said, "on the porch." "This is a different question." She waited. "I want to know if you'd be willing to make this permanent," he said. "All of it. The ranch, the work, and me, for whatever that's worth. I'm not—" He stopped and started again, which was unusual for him. "I'm not a straightforward thing. I know that. I've been somewhere else for 2 years, and I'm not all the way back yet. I've got a grandmother who is still difficult, and a ranch that is solvent but not comfortable, and a barn roof that needs replacing, and a hand who will probably leave in a year when he figures out what he actually wants to do." He paused. I'm not offering you something easy. I know that, she'd said. I'm offering you something real, he said. That's what I have. She looked at him in the lantern light. This man who had stood at the top of 2 steps outside a land office and handed her a piece of shale and said, I'm not hiring, I'm asking, as if he'd known then that those were different things and that one of them mattered more. She thought about what it had cost her to say yes that day and what it had cost him to ask, and all the small honest moments between that one and this one. She thought about the 6 towns. She thought about the borrowed horse and the $11 and the way she'd stood on the sidewalk eating bread and calculating distance. She thought about what it felt like to be a person the world keeps deciding to move along, how after a while you start to help it, to leave before you're pushed, to pack before you're asked, to never fully unpack at all. She had unpacked here. Not the bag. The bag could wait. The bag was just things. But the rest of it. The part that knew where the table edge was in the dark and how the floor creaked and what the cattle sounded like at night. The part that left tea on the stove and knew how Deacon took his coffee and recognized the specific sound of Jack's boots in the barn. That part had unpacked without her permission over the course of an ordinary summer, and the truth was, she didn't want to pack it back up. I know what you're offering, she said. I'm not looking for easy either. She met his eyes. Yes, Jack. He let out a breath. That's it? He said. Just yes? What else do you need? He looked at her for a moment, and then something in him that had been careful for a long time stopped being careful, and he leaned forward and took her face in both hands with the specific gentleness of someone who knew the weight of what they were holding. And he kissed her, and it was not smooth or rehearsed or particularly graceful. She was still holding a wrench, which she became aware of mid-kiss and set carefully on the ground. But it was real, which was the only thing she'd ever wanted anything to be. They were married in October, on a morning when the valley had gone gold, and the light had that particular autumn quality of being both warm and final. They did it simply. A brief ceremony in the county clerk's office in Caldwell Crossing, with Hattie and Tommy as witnesses, and Deacon standing outside with the horses because the office was small, and he claimed he'd seen enough weddings to know when he wasn't needed inside, though Sarah noticed he was still there when they came out. There was no large celebration. They weren't those kinds of people, either of them. Hattie made a dinner, a real one, with effort, and Tommy ate 3 plates and made a toast that was slightly too long and heartfelt in the way that 20-year-olds sometimes were. And Deacon sat at the table for the whole meal, which was itself a statement. Eleanor Marsh came and brought wine that was better than anything available in Caldwell Crossing and didn't stay past 8, which was exactly right. Sarah sat at the table and looked at the people around it and felt something that she had not felt in so long that she'd nearly forgotten what it was, the specific calm of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Not arrived at, not achieved, just there, simply and without drama. She had spent so much of the past few years in motion that stillness had become something she didn't trust. She'd learned to interpret it as temporary, to expect the next move, to keep some part of herself ready to go. Sitting at that table, she felt something slowly releasing in her that had been held a very long time, not all at once. That wasn't how it worked, not really. But enough that she could feel the change. Go. The year that followed was not an easy one. Easy years were not what the frontier offered, and she'd never expected one. The winter came in hard in January, and they lost 2 fence sections to ice damage, and one of the older cows to a fall in the frozen creek bed, which was a genuine loss and hurt the way real losses did. Jack's back gave him trouble for 6 weeks in February, which meant Sarah was running more of the physical work, which she did, though not without the particular short-tempered exhaustion that came from doing too much for too long. She was not a saint about it. There were mornings she was curt in ways she regretted, and at least one evening where she said something to Jack about the fence repair schedule that was sharper than warranted and had to be addressed later, carefully. They addressed it. That was the thing. They could address it. They'd both been alone with their own difficulties long enough to know how bad it was to have no one to work things out with, and so even the harder conversations had a foundation under them, the knowledge that the conversation itself mattered and that the other person was willing to have it. By spring, the back had resolved, and the herd was up to 35 with the new calves, and Eleanor had sent 2 women her way, a widowed farmer named Cecilia Pratt, who needed help with her goats, and a young woman from a homestead to the west who was trying to understand why her cattle kept drifting. And Sarah had helped both of them, and the word continued to move through the valley in its quiet way. She had not set out to be a resource for other women managing land on their own. It had simply happened because the need was there, and she happened to be the person who could address it. But she began to notice something. The women who came to her were not helpless. They were capable people managing complicated situations with insufficient support, which was a different thing and required a different kind of help. Not rescue, but knowledge. Not charity, but skill shared person to person. She started writing things down. Not formally, not with any particular plan, just the things she knew, the specific practical knowledge about soil and livestock and equipment that she'd accumulated over years of paying attention. She wrote in the evening sometimes, at the kitchen table, and Hattie occasionally looked over her shoulder and added things from her own 40 years, and the document grew without anyone deciding it was a document. Tommy left in the spring, as Jack had said he would. He'd been offered a position at a horse breeding operation north of the valley, which was the work he'd been circling toward all along, and he came to tell them on a Wednesday with the expression of someone who expected the news to be received poorly. "That's good work," Sarah said immediately. "When do you start?" He looked relieved in a way that broke her heart slightly. He'd been worried they'd make it hard. "Next month," he said. "Then you've got a month to finish what you've started here," Jack said, "and we'll send you off right." They did. His last dinner at the ranch was another real one. Hattie cooked, which was not an everyday occurrence by any means. And Sarah made the cornbread, and Deacon sat at the table and said, "The horse work will suit you," to Tommy in the tone of someone delivering a compliment they'd been holding for a while, which was the nicest thing Deacon had said to anyone all year. Tommy hugged Sarah when he left the next morning, which she hadn't expected, and she let him, and he rode out of the yard in the early light with the specific energy of someone heading toward the right thing, which was what you wanted for people you'd come to care about. There was a morning in late summer, a year after she'd ridden into Caldwell Crossing on a borrowed horse with $11 and the expectation of being turned away, when Sarah walked the fence line before the light was fully up, the way she always did, and stopped at the southeast corner of the south pasture where the new steel post stood. She put her hand on the nearest post. It was solid. The ground around it had gone through a full winter and a wet spring and a dry early summer, and the post had not moved, had not shifted, held exactly as she'd designed it to hold. She stood there for a while in the early quiet, looking out at the pasture where the cattle were beginning to move with the first light. The garden was visible from here, past the south wall of the house. She could see the late summer green of it, the beans and the tomatoes and the herbs along the wall. Hattie's work and hers together, growing in the way that things grew when they were tended honestly. She thought about the women who had come to her this year, Cecilia Pratt, who had sorted out her goats and came back 2 months later not with a problem, but with a question. She wanted to know more about the soil work, wanted to understand why her pasture was what it was. The young woman from the West homestead, whose name was Ada, who had come back twice more and who Sarah had learned was entirely self-taught, and was teaching herself from results and failures in the way that Sarah had once done, and who just needed someone to say, "What you're seeing is real, and here's why." She thought about the document she and Hattie had been adding to all winter, which had grown into something she hadn't quite intended. 30 pages now, specific and practical. The kind of thing that would have been useful to her 10 years ago and that she hadn't had. She didn't know what to do with it yet. Eleanor had looked at it and said it was worth printing, which felt too large a claim, but the idea had stayed. She thought about what it meant to have been the woman nobody wanted, and to have become something else. Not through being proven right dramatically, not through a single moment of vindication, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary days in which she showed up and did the work, and let that be what it was. There was a lesson in that, though she was wary of lessons because they had a way of flattening things. The true version of it was messier than a lesson. The true version was that she had been lucky. Lucky that Jack had seen her with that horse. Lucky that Hattie had come to her room that night. Lucky that the meeting had gone the way it had, and not some other way. Luck was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. But luck needed something to land on. It needed a person who had kept going past 6 rejections instead of stopping at 3, who had cleaned her boots even when she was down to her last few dollars because something in her refused to arrive anywhere, looking like she'd already given up. It needed a person who could go into a ditch with a frightened animal and come out without making it into a story about herself, who could receive care from a difficult old woman without making it awkward, who could say yes to uncertain things because the alternative, a life of never saying yes to anything that might not work out, was a kind of poverty she recognized and refused. She heard the back door and heard Jack's boots in the yard, and then heard him coming along the fence line toward her, the specific sound of him that she knew now without needing to see. He came up beside her and looked out at the cattle. "Early," he said. "Always," she said. He put his hand over hers on the fence post, briefly, the way you touch something you trusted. "Hattie wants to expand the garden," he said, "south end of the yard where the old corral was. That ground needs amending, 2 seasons probably before it's ready." "I know, I told her that." He paused. "She said she had time." Sarah looked at the house, at the window where Hattie's lamp was already on. She was always the first to rise now, or tied with Sarah some mornings, and thought about what it meant that Hattie Callaway was planning 2 seasons ahead, what it meant that she'd said she had time. "Then we'll start on it this fall," Sarah said. "Get the First Amendment in before the ground freezes." Jack nodded. They stood together in the early light, and the cattle moved through the pasture, and the garden held its late summer color against the south wall of the house, and the valley opened up around them with the particular silence of a place that had become legible, that you knew the sounds of and the silences of, that you had learned the way you learned anything worth knowing, slowly, honestly, by showing up. She had come here with nothing and had thought that was the condition she was in. She understood now that it wasn't nothing. It was just everything stripped down to what was actually hers. The work she could do, the honesty she insisted on, the specific stubbornness that had kept her moving past the 6th door that closed in her face when a more sensible version of herself might have stopped at the 2nd or 3rd. She had carried those things into a valley that hadn't asked for her, and the valley had kept her anyway. Not because it was kind, the frontier was not kind, had never claimed to be, but because real things had a way of persisting when they were given enough room. She looked out at the land and felt it under her. Not metaphorically, actually, the ground through the soles of her boots, the particular density of soil that had been worked and amended and understood, that had her fence posts in it now, holding. She had not been searching for a place to work. She understood that now in a way she hadn't that first morning, riding in on a borrowed horse with her expectations managed down to almost nothing. She had been searching for a place where the work she could do would be received as what it actually was, where she could be seen clearly without the story getting in the way of the person. She had found it. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect, and she'd learned to be suspicious of perfect anyway. She had found it truly, which was the only version of found that lasted. The sun came up over the east ridge, and the valley went gold with it, the way it did every morning, indifferent and consistent and real. She watched it come.